Rich has a very eclectic background as well. Probably most of the speakers in this series do. He has an undergraduate degree from Cornell in, what was it, Environment and Society?
Biology and Society.
Biology and Society. He then got a master's degree from Wisconsin in Environmental Studies, and he has a PhD from Berkeley in the Energy and Resources group. And we were saying that probably he's one of the first people who actually got a PhD in ecological economics, although it wasn't exactly called that at the time. But the content and the approach, I think, was very consistent with what we're talking about. So he's one of the first PhDs in ecological economics in 1990, that was, and then he went on to a job at Lawrence Berkeley, and then Santa Cruz in the Environmental Studies Department there for a couple of years, and then to Dartmouth in 1998. He's going to be talking today about, what was it again? The psychology of well-being. And that's coming out of a book that's recently out called Status, Growth, and the Environment from Edward Elgar. And we'll leave a copy of this on the table. And again, as we did last week, for those of you who weren't here, the questions that were asked to Richard, after the talk, we would like to have you write them down on these pieces of paper that are coming around. We'll collect those at the end. We have a couple of students who are taking the class for credit. Once they're passing out the paper, they'll come and collect them, and they'll try to summarize and synthesize, at least, and ask the same question more than once. So if there's the same question being asked over and over again, they'll get some priority in terms of being asked. And then if there are any questions that we don't have time to get to during the question period after the class, we will type those up and send them to Richard over email, and he'll get a response back, and so that will be put up on the website for the course, and we can go back and look at the answers to those questions. Okay, Richard.
Okay. I'd like to thank Bob for inviting me to come and give this talk, and then I'd like to thank you for participating, and I'd particularly like to thank the technical people for eliminating the annoying whining sound that we were just hearing.
Louder, please.
Actually, so we're not hearing. What's that? Okay. This here? Let's see. Okay, is that better? Yes. Okay. The title of this presentation is The Psychology of Well-Being. This is a chapter title from this book, Status, Growth, and the Environment, that has just come out. It's co-written with my Norwegian colleague, Kjell Arne Breka. And what I want to do today is to talk about some details from this chapter. I also want to set this particular narrow piece of work into the broader perspective of what this book is about, which is to say, in addition to the chapter that I'll talk about, is really a literature review of psychological and social thinking on the nature of well-being and its relationship to economic growth, for example. And I'll talk about that, but I also want to abstract some ideas from this literature review and talk about what it means for ecological economics. Now, ecological economics, as I'm sure you know, is a cross-cutting transdisciplinary field. Substantively, it's concerned with managing the links between economic systems and ecological systems. It's not a dispassionate field that's distanced from practice, however. It's a field that's very much concerned with managing real-world problems. So ecological economics is concerned with goals like promoting human well-being, which is one way to think about economic development, for example. Ecological economics is also concerned with fairness or equity. It's concerned with the problem of sustainability. So it's an approach which is wrestling with how to take these different goals, these different concepts that come to us from different intellectual traditions, actually, and then put them together in a way that allows us to make progress towards resolving environmental problems. I'm going to talk today about this first point, about well-being and its measurement, and how a grounded conception of well-being can be used in policy analysis and in resource management. I won't talk about the fairness problem. I won't talk about specifically the sustainability problem. I should say that ultimately these three parts need to be put into one model, one perspective. I'm not going to succeed in painting that picture for you today, though. So I'll look just at this first problem about well-being, what it is as a concept, how we can measure it, where that takes us. A starting point really is to think about the way that welfare is typically measured in neoclassical applied welfare economics. And neoclassical economics, applied welfare economics at least, rests upon an underlying assumption, an underlying model in which consumption, consumer goods, the consumption of material commodities, generates pure social benefits. We're used to the idea in applied economics that more is better, and that if a person's material consumption increases, then they're better off. And based upon this assumption, we can use money, which is a measure of consumption on one level, as a measuring rod of well-being. Now, of course, environmental economics takes this idea and develops it in some ways which I suspect most of you are familiar with. On the one hand, we have externality theory. So we have problems in which a business or a consumer, a household, undertakes actions which impose environmental harms. Those are uninternalized externalities, costs that the individual's actions impose on everyone else. It's not reflected in markets. It's not reflected in market prices. So what we know from environmental economics, or what we're taught to think about, is that we should put a price on externalities. We should put a price on the environment. We should measure the value of the environment in monetary units. And that if we get the prices right, if we do monetary cost-benefit analysis, then we can achieve economic efficiency. And economic efficiency is a goal. It's an important goal to the extent that we think that we maximize net benefits. And what we're aiming to do ultimately is to maximize some notion of well-being. Okay. Now, I can also push this in another direction. That has to do with natural resource accounting. Externality theory is concerned with partial equilibrium, one small issue, one step at a time. Resource accounting is concerned with adjusting broad measures of economic welfare at the national level to account for environmental degradation and the depletion of natural capital. Bob has made seminal contributions to this literature. This also rests on the idea that an indicator like gross domestic output, a dollar measure of economic activity, provides an index or a measure of economic welfare. And the idea here is to extend that measure by accounting for the monetary value of resource depletion and environmental degradation. What I want to do in this talk, what the book does, is it critically examines this hypothesis. The hypothesis is nearly true, nor is it completely false. We need to replace it with a somewhat more elaborate way of thinking. And when we do that, we get a different, it makes a difference, as I'll explain. Okay. So the standard model from applied welfare economics. Welfare economics tends to assume the standard model that you learn in graduate school is that preferences come from outside of the system. They're determined by people's genes or their biology or maybe by the culture that they live in. But the economist tends to take preferences or values as being outside of the realm of what economists can or should study. Okay, and very importantly, the key thing on point one here is to note that in applied welfare economics, we assume generally that people's preferences are independent of prevailing economic conditions. So people's decisions in markets don't have feedback effects, which then alter their preferences. A second assumption is, it can be stated as it's stated on the slide, which is to say that the consumption of market goods, commodities, material goods, generates benefits that are rival and exclusive. That means these are private goods, and my well-being, my consumption affects my well-being and only my well-being, and doesn't have consequences for anybody else. In particular, my consumption, what I consume, what I own, doesn't have effects on what other people come to value. If we make these assumptions, we wind up with a relatively elegant, tractable model of people's behavior and of their preferences. We can use it to study how the economy works. We can use it to do cost-benefit analysis and resource accounting. The problem here, though, is that these assumptions in this model that I'm critiquing now, it really doesn't stack up very well with evidence and theories that come to us from fields like social psychology, cultural anthropology, aspects of sociology. So what I want to do is to look at what some of the evidence is, what some of the theories are, and then see where that takes us. Okay. So where I'm going to come out is, in place of these two assumptions, what I want to argue for you is that people's preferences as consumers, and therefore the welfare or satisfaction that they derive from goods and services, depends in a rather fundamental way on their relative economic status. Not absolutely how much income or consumption they have, but how what they have compares to social norms that are prevailing in society. And then the second part is that when we shift our frame of analysis to account for what I'm representing as a fact under point 1 here, that changes pretty fundamentally the way that we think about standard measures of economic value. It means in particular that monetary measures overvalue changes in private consumption, market consumption, and they undervalue changes in environmental quality and public goods. So there's a bias here. Now, this isn't a new idea. This is a very old idea. It's not even an idea exactly that comes to us from outside of the main body of economic thought. Adam Smith had a model, a way of thinking. It was a conceptual model rather than an analytical model. But Adam Smith had an idea and a feeling for some of the issues that I'm talking about here. In Wealth of Nations, there are passages in which Adam Smith writes things, for example, that an English person in his day and age would be ashamed to appear in public without wearing leather shoes and linen shirts. Why leather shoes and linen shirts? Well, I'm not sure. Maybe because in that day and age, SUVs hadn't yet been invented. The point Smith was making was that in other parts of Europe, with lower income, a lower material standard of living than England had at that time, you didn't need these particular goods to appear in public without shame. The social norms were different, and what was socially required of people in England was not socially required of people in Scotland, say. One way of saying this is to say that in a wealthy society, people both expect and they're expected to achieve a higher material standard of living. And if you don't achieve a high material standard of living, if you don't have the right shoes or the right shirt or the right truck, then you don't fit in. You might be ashamed, or you might experience some sense that you weren't really part of the in crowd or the right group. And what Smith is telling us is that the reason that people are consuming these goods is less because the goods are valuable in themselves, which is what standard microeconomic theory says, than because they're delivering some social message, or they're anchoring person. I'm anchoring my identity in what I wear or what I drive. And that changes things. Thorstein Veblen, he's a Norwegian American who wrote about 100 years ago about the sort of state of affairs in the latter portion of the Gilded Age, which period was like now: rapid economic growth, or like America in the 1990s, I should say. Rapid economic growth, widening disparity between the rich and the poor, and the wealthy were engaged in a kind of game that Veblen characterized as conspicuous consumption, which meant the purchase and display of of expensive goods to establish your standing in your community, in your social network. What Veblen said was, again, it's not having the big diamond that matters. It's not the SUV that matters. What matters is your own perception of your sense of being a contributing, valued member of the community, your own sense of standing in the community, and also the very real social benefits that individuals get when they're accepted by others and when others rank their social status as high. So what's happening is that Veblen and Smith are painting a world in which goods are used really to signal and anchor our sense of personal identity and our standing in the community. Okay. And then this idea we can bring sort of right up to the present in the work of Robert Frank at Cornell. Frank takes this idea about conspicuous consumption, and essentially he argues that what Veblen was writing about in the 1890s was true in the 1990s as well. And then he has this whole argument about how essentially consumption generates social costs which aren't reflected in individual incentives. And he makes an argument for why we should have a tax on luxury goods or on lavish lifestyles, actually, as a way of achieving a better outcome, a better society. He's saying that because people are concerned about relative economic position, that we wind up with an economy which provides too much private consumption, particularly for social elites, and not enough in the way of, public goods, environmental quality, all of that. He's saying that the market creates a kind of uneven playing field where we're striking the wrong balance. Another really important book along the same lines, on the same kind of theme, is from Juliet Schor, who's really looking at the boundary between sociology and economics at the, this idea, again, that an important aspect of preferences and economic motivation has to do with social status and identity. Now, so far I've talked sort of in words, kind of theoretically, conceptually, I guess I should say. There are data here. I'm not going to confront you with graphs of data. I suppose I could do so. That's not really the purpose of my talk. What I want to say, though, is that to make the case that Veblen made, or that Robert Frank has made, I don't have to just construct an argument about my intuitions or feelings about what's going on in society. There are empirical data of various stripes that I can look to sort of test and evaluate this idea. Richard Easterlin, he's an economist at USC, published a really important paper in 1974, which you probably haven't heard about, but you should all read it. It's a really superb paper. I think it's a seminal paper. He looked at a concept that's called subjective well-being. Now, what's that? Subjective well-being is a measure that's based on social surveys which have been taken in a variety of industrialized and developing nations since World War II. It's basically a person's self-assessment, their personal subjective evaluation of their overall life satisfaction. So subjective well-being is a survey-based, indicator of people's satisfaction with life. I've said that data on this, on subjective well-being, or SWB, have been collected since World War II in a variety of countries. What Easterlin did was he looked at the statistical relationship between life satisfaction and income and other economic variables, or social variables, not just economic variables. I want to call your attention to an idea that's called the Easterlin paradox. And this was the empirical generalization that Easterlin thought he saw in his cloud of data when he was drawing lines through the data using regression techniques. The first point is that at any given time, in any given society, an individual who has a high income is likely to be more satisfied with life than someone who has a lower income. So that conforms to this intuition that more is better, and that as my income or consumption level rises, then my life satisfaction rises as well. That looks like the standard assumption in applied welfare economics. But there's two further points. One is that if you look at time series data for the US, for Japan, life satisfaction as gathered in these surveys is a flat line. It looks like the EKG of someone who has recently died. Income has grown hugely. In Japan, since World War II, income has grown hugely. Life satisfaction has not grown. In the US, life satisfaction has ticked up a little bit, although income has risen a lot. And what seems to be the case is that economic growth, at least in Easterlin's data, hasn't really delivered the goods in terms of having people be more satisfied. There's another point that Easterlin thought he saw in his data, point 3, and that is that if you look at comparisons of average life satisfaction and average income or economic activity in rich and poor countries, then he thought there was no statistical relationship. Easterlin himself has moved away from point 3 based upon more recent data. I'll return to that in a minute. The important point is that Easterlin interpreted these data in a simple but I think plausible way. And that is to say that, that a person's relative economic status, their relative consumption or their relative income, relative to others in the society they're living in, matters. It might be the principal determinant of what affects your well-being, at least in terms of the economic contributors to well-being. And that absolute income is less important than one might otherwise suppose. Now, let's see. I can then critically examine the Easterlin paradox. There are methodological questions, there are data questions that I can raise. Let's start with a methodological question. I could act as a social scientist whether this idea of subjective well-being, people's stated satisfaction in life, whether this is a meaningful concept, whether it points to something that's a true characteristic of a human being, whether I could measure it in a way that's valid in some sense. This is, from a social science perspective, this is the question of internal and external validity. Economists, on the whole, don't really like surveys very much. I suppose you know about contingent valuation, and you know the controversies that surround the contingent valuation method and whether its results are valid or not. Some of the same kinds of issues come to bear here. Those concerns are, well, they're warranted. It's a good question to ask. But there's actually, in the psychological literature, there's some evidence actually that this is a meaningful concept that we can measure. That does tell us something that we should pay attention to. And this is reviewed in the book chapter that has been distributed here. A very thorough set of, I think it's 20 or 30 papers is in this recent book by Danny Kahneman. Recent Nobel laureate in economics, although he's an economic psychologist. But, you know, this is a superb book. What we know is that what the psychologists tell us is that people's subjective well-being correlates well with symptoms of anxiety and depression and other psychological disorders. And it correlates with self-esteem and optimism, their ability to accomplish tasks in the world. Very interestingly and importantly, my assessment of Bob's subjective well-being, my assessment of his satisfaction with life, is likely to be run pretty closely together with what Bob himself says. So even though we don't know how people do it, somehow we're able to read each other, and what Bob says seems to be verifiable by others, at least others' opinions of him. I guess. I'm not sure how far I want to go down that road. And this doesn't relate to Bob, actually, but if I go deeper down, subjective well-being is correlated with more fundamental mood states. Positive or negative affect, it's called in psychology, which is whether I'm in a good or a bad mood, vaguely. But subjective well-being is correlated with the degree to which people experience these more fundamental mood states. And those mood states are correlated with things like blood pressure and hormones and brain waves and other things that we can scientifically measure. So we're not, there's reasons to think that this indicator, despite the fact that it's based on just what people say on surveys, you know, it seems to have some interest and some importance and validity. Okay. Now, my second question here really is how Easterlin's results stand up with respect to more up-to-date evidence. He's writing in '74. Here we are almost 30 years later. And the landscape looks slightly different in light of the more recent data than it did using the shorter time series that Easterlin was looking at. Here, Ronald Englehart's World Value Survey is an important source. The book by Kahneman et al. Also contains some of this evidence. But what seems to be true is that if you look at societies with real low incomes, below, say, $6,000 per person per year, going from being extremely poor to having a moderate income, that seems to improve well-being in society quite a lot, provided that the income is channeled into meeting people's basic human needs. Obviously, meeting basic human needs has a profound bearing on life satisfaction, and economic growth can really be important to the extent that it's being channeled into meeting basic needs. My co-author doesn't like it when I tell the story that way, but he's not here, so that's the way I tell the story. In high-income societies, though, there's diminishing returns. We don't see economic growth in a place like the United States generating big increases in people's perceived life satisfaction. So that's robust. And it's still the case that in any given time, in any given society, those with high relative incomes are more satisfied than those with low relative incomes. So that's one way of thinking about it, these survey reports of subjective well-being. Another way of looking at it is due to, well, there's a couple of studies. One is by Solnick and Hemingway. It's from the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization from 5 years ago now. This is also survey-based, but the survey has a different form. You take a group of respondents and you ask them a hypothetical question, as though you were doing contingent valuation, actually, but it's a hypothetical question. Essentially, would you rather be a rich person in a poor society or a poor person in a rich society? That's what's happening up here. So 50,000, you're earning 50,000 a year with a social average of 25 versus there you are earning 100,000 in a society where your neighbors are earning 200,000. Which would you choose? And the survey is done in a sophisticated way so that it's clear that you're talking about real differences in purchasing power, not differences in the price level in society. You know, so I'm summarizing, but this is done in a sophisticated, interesting way. And what's interesting is that the respondents here they were split. Half chose point 1, half chose point 2. You could say that a typical member of society was indifferent between these options. And what that means is that people care both about the absolute consumption, how much stuff they have, and also what their relative position is. And they see a trade-off there. Okay. A similar study is by a Swedish group led by Per Olof Johansson Stenman at the University of Gothenburg. He did the same kind of study, only he didn't ask, would you rather be in society A or B? Instead, he asked, well, looking towards the future for your grandchildren, what kind of society would you like your grandchildren to live in? He gets exactly the same kinds of results. In fact, what's interesting is that both the Johansson Stenman et al. Study and the study by Solnick and Hemingway are consistent with a model in which people's underlying well-being, their utility, their life satisfaction, is a logarithmic function defined over absolute consumption and relative consumption, economic status, and with the weight attached to social status being around 1/3. Now, obviously, that 1/3 could be a higher or a lower number, but the point here is that it's not zero. It's a significant and a positive number. And if I don't have this caring about social status entering into people's utility function or our description of their preferences, there's no way I can describe these data. And there's no way that I can describe the Easterlin paradox. So this model from a scientific perspective, this is just a better model. It's more theory consistent than the model that says that it's only how much stuff you have that matters, not your social standing. All right. What does this mean then? What do we do with it? Let me make sure I'm on the right page so that what's behind me is it's the same as what's in front of me, actually. Herman Daly wrote about this in the 1970s in Steady State Economics. In fact, that's one of the sources that got me going in ecological economics and got me thinking about this particular idea. Other important works were Fred Hirsch's Social Limits to Growth, and then Bob Frank's Choosing the Right Pond, written late 70s, mid-1980s. All three of these authors were looking at the Easterlin paradox and other data of that ilk, and saying that it sure looked as though an important part of economic behavior had to do with social status, the pursuit of social status, high relative position in society. They argued that this generated social costs. How is that true? Well, when my income rises, then Bob's relative position goes down, and Bob feels badly about that. And all the rest of you feel badly about that. If my satisfaction with my income depends upon the average in society, then as the average in society goes up, my satisfaction goes down. That's the problem. That's an externality. It's like the problem of overfishing in an open access fishery. It's like polluting the air. It's an externality, and it's not an internalized externality, actually. That's the problem. So what these authors and others in this literature have suggested sort of informally is that when social status counts, then monetary measures overvalue changes in private consumption and undervalue, underestimate the value of collective goods, public goods, environmental quality. And also that social status can lead to possibly excessive rates of economic growth, or at least it can lead to an economy in which we're devoting too many resources to support private consumption, the production and consumption of private goods, and allocating too few resources to collective goods, and we're striking the wrong balance between economic production and the environment. Okay. So what our book does is it provides some background on all of this, and it digs into these details, the details of this argument in a range of models, actually. So there's some literature review of the sort that I'm describing for you here, and then there's a lot of economic modeling in the last half of the book or so. And we're looking at the idea that relative consumption contributes importantly to people's well-being. And then we're looking at what difference it makes when we introduce relative consumption into preferences, what difference that makes in terms of externality theory, or in terms of optimal taxation, or the economics of climate change, or the debates over environmental equivalence curves. So there's a bunch of applications here. But I'm going to leave you with it, but if Bob will let me have a couple of more minutes, then I can show you at least some graphs, which will show you some model routes to give you a flavor of it. But the general take-home message of all of this is that if you believe the kind of data that you get from Hudson Stenman et al. And from Solnick and Hemingway, relative consumption effects imply that standard measures of environmental benefits understate full social benefits by around 50%, plus or minus. So by a significant amount. There will be large error bars around this because we're extrapolating from a relatively small number of studies, but it's not zero. And the other thing is that if private consumption imposes external costs, which it does if relative economic position matters, then you need a tax on consumption to internalize that social cost. And in these models that we're working with, the optimal consumption tax has a 50% marginal rate. That sounds shocking, except when you think about it. In the United States, we have roughly a 30, maybe 35% income tax, and a 30 or 35% income tax isn't that different from a 50% consumption tax. And maybe in the question and answers, I mean, we could come back to this. You could have a tax that had a high top rate for people who were consuming a lot, and had a lower tax rate for people who were consuming less. That also might be consistent with this approach. That's what Bob Frank calls for. Okay. So I'll end with just some, just a flavor of some model runs. One of the applications has to do with the economics of climate change. And what Chelarda and I did is we took a very standard vanilla-flavored conventional model on the costs and benefits of climate change. Those of you who know this literature, it's the dynamic integrated model of climate and the economy by William Nordhaus at Yale. And there's some good things about this model, and there's some questions about this model, but we took this model and we introduced relative consumption effects to it. That's what we did, to make a long story short. So in this model, this parameter alpha reflects the weight that people attach to relative consumption. And I told you that if you believe the Johansson-Stenman Solnick-Hemingway data, you choose a value of alpha that's around 1/3. And Nordhaus, who ignores these issues, essentially he's choosing a value of 0. So I want to see what difference it makes in the model's performance with one value versus another. Well, it makes a lot of difference. These are model runs for varying levels of alpha. And the higher the alpha, the more the social status matters, and the less the pure consumption matters. And alpha equals 0, which is basically the top line, is the optimal consumption path in the case where there's no status seeking, there's no status effects. And what you can see is that you get a higher consumption profile. The highest consumption profile occurs in the case where status effects are absent. This corresponds to the case where status effects are present but are not being taxed. And then we're looking here at optimal outcomes as the degree of social status seeking increases. So what we're seeing here is that if we internalized status externalities, we would see lower consumption levels, redirect resources away from private consumption. This is labor effort. Nordhaus's base model doesn't involve a labor-leisure trade-off. Ours does, in part because one of the concerns that you have about status-seeking behavior is that people might spend extra hours at work so that they can buy extra luxury goods or whatever good it is that we think is signaling social status. So one of the things that could happen here is that you could strike a poor balance between consumption and leisure time. Leisure time also would involve time with your family and friends and community. So there's spillovers from that as well that we're not explicitly looking at. What you see is that, in the absence of a status tax, the people spend maybe 1/3 of their waking hours working, which is what the top lines are about. And that as the severity of social status seeking increases, and in particular as the level of the status tax increases, then the optimal level of labor effort shifts down. And for reasonable parameter values, that effect is, it's not gargantuan. I mean, remember, I think maybe alpha is between somewhere on the order of 1/3. So maybe, you can sort of tease out where that would be on these charts. Here's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the same story. If we internalize the social cost of social status seeking, then we want to have a lower time profile for greenhouse gas emissions rather than a higher time path for greenhouse gas emissions. And because greenhouse gas emissions drive climate change, or are a principal contributor to climate change, then the more important this parameter alpha is, then the further we go towards stabilizing climate. There's significant temperature increases in all of these model runs, and that happens for a bunch of reasons. It happens in part because Nordhaus is pretty pessimistic about the ability to reduce greenhouse gases emissions cost effectively, and he's optimistic that society could adapt to future climate change without too much in the way of economic cost. I'm not sure I buy that argument. That's built into this model. If we change that assumption, of course, we could get lower, optimal temperature profiles might be different. Okay. And I'll sum up very briefly, and then I understand that my main engagement here with you today is to answer questions, which I'll be very happy to do. This is my last slide. I think I'm actually pretty much on the time scale that will be talked about. So, okay. So just to summarize, cost-benefit analysis and resource accounting, tools like that ecological economics draws from applied welfare economics and from resource and environmental economics. This rests on a model in which people's well-being just depends upon how much stuff they have. So their absolute level of consumption. And people's preferences are fixed and they're independent of social context. That's the normal model. The second point is that there are data that suggest that that's not a very good description of real-world human beings. Scientifically, we should reject the hypothesis that's contained in the first point. And we have models, actually, that do a better job of accounting for the data that we have in hand. And I can get there just doing positivist, regular science, regular social science. I don't need to get into a big social critique to get here. Although in this literature, of course, you can, that option is available to you too. I don't want to denigrate that, but in this talk and in this work, we're doing sort of regular-looking, positivistic, traditional social science, and it gets us here. If we make reasonable assumptions, i.e. data-consistent assumptions about the importance of data seeking, then we see that that monetary valuation overstates the benefits of private consumption, and it understates the benefits of non-market goods. Not just the environment, public goods in general. So social goods as well as environmental goods, although our focus here has been mainly on the environment. And finally, in this kind of a world, you need institutional arrangements or you need policies that strike the right balance between the individual and society. The free market isn't the answer here. I'm not arguing against markets, mind you. I'm actually in favor of the market. I think the market is a very effective way of organizing a society. But when there's social costs, then you need public policies to internalize and address those social costs. And one really interesting outcome here is that, at least in this model, the optimal policy response is a tax on consumption. Taxes in this model on income or consumption are a way of balancing costs and benefits to promote well-being and to maximize social well-being. They are a good thing and a beneficial thing rather than a bad and costly thing. And that point exists in the social discourse where in Washington taxes are bad, they're inefficient, they're welfare reducing, all of that. Okay, well, you've been very patient. I will be quiet for a moment and then you will interrogate me, I suppose. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Richard. I know you were a challenge for the cameraman as well. But we're going to take past your questions to the aisles, and we'll pick those up, and then the students will begin the interrogation. Starting with water. Water, yes. Kenny, where are you? Yeah, maybe you get some water with you. That's part of our interrogation style. These bright lights and water.
Well, there actually are bright lights, so that's a good point.
So, and for those of you who aren't aware, some of the questions will be coming from the students who had asked the questions prior to the hearing talk based on the reading the paper, submitting what we read, and the rest are coming from the audience here. Okay, our visitors are ready. And again, what we're trying to emphasize with this discussion, we're trying to look for not an argument, not a debate in the traditional sense, but a way to build shared understanding about these issues, acknowledging that these are complex issues. They're not simple black and white problems. And so we've asked The students who are writing the questions, and let me ask again to the audience to pose your questions in that way. Hopefully the answers are going to be the same form. Maybe if you could stand at the
What do you think affects a person's subjective well-being more? The money they have to buy materialistic goods or their status in society?
I'm not sure that's an either-or question. What I know, what psychologists tell us that study this, is that the main contributors to a person's well-being are things like their social relationships, their family relationships, and it matters really fundamentally whether their basic material needs are taken care of. There's a colleague of mine at Dartmouth actually who's done a study suggesting that when people get divorced, that reduces their well-being by a level that's like losing $100,000 a year of income. So first of all, it's a mistake probably to think that well-being is driven primarily by economic variables. It's not. I guess my point would be that when we're looking at the contribution that comes from goods and services, that has a component that's related to just the direct employment of goods for themselves. And then it has to do also with the way in which my consumption anchors my identity in society, and how I stack up in comparison in relation to social norms, prevailing social norms in society. And that instrumentally, as it works out, your social standing matters, and your social standing is defined actually in terms of variables like relative income and relative consumption. That's a somewhat elusive answer to your question, but that's how I see it.
Do you think competitive impulses are part of the psychological makeup of many people, leaving them unable to consider a paradigm in which raising the human community's standard of living is the ultimate goal? Since competition is a fundamental part of capitalism, do you think it is possible for our society's subjective well-being to increase from a non-capitalist system?
Well, I like that question a lot. It has different components to it. One of the things that strikes me about the conventional economic model is that it has a very flat, narrow way of thinking about human beings. They care about stuff, which makes people, well, competitive, you could say, or materialistic, all of those things. I guess I think as a social scientist that people are competitive, people are also cooperative. People care about themselves, they also care about others in society. To an extent, whether you have a society in which the competitive impulse dominates or the cooperative impulse dominates, it depends a lot upon the structure of how the particular system is set up. We live in a society which is based on individualism and it brings out the competition. So in a way, I guess I'm arguing that I would change that. What I'd say, though, is that I can identify other market-based societies, the Nordic countries, for example, that are also, they're market-based, but they have a strong government role, and they also have strong community institutions. So I'm not sure it's capitalism versus not capitalism. I think it's a question about the market is good at doing certain kinds of things, and it's good in particular in promoting the individualist values and the competitive part of what we do. It needs to be reined in and accompanied by other mechanisms that allow us to cooperate. So I'm not an anti-capitalist, although I am a social democrat. And this work is informed by that, of course.
Many people may argue that minorities in the U.S. are still suppressed today. Statistically, African Americans and Hispanics have lower incomes on average than Asian Americans and whites. The question is, has there been any current research done in the U.S. on the effects of race on subjective well-being?
I'm not aware that there has been, but that doesn't mean that it's not been done. I suspect probably it has been done, but I don't know that part of the literature. The point is well taken, though, and it's something that definitely would want to see. It would complement this kind of approach that I've described here, I think.
Much of a person's well-being seems to stem from their sense of individualistic accomplishment placed in society. If people had a greater focus, a much greater goal to strive for, not just for themselves or their family, but for society, would their sense of well-being change? Would people change their view of well-being based on what they have done for their society, outside environment, and world, not just what they have accomplished for themselves?
I'll play amateur sociologist with you. If you live in a market-based society, social norms can arise under which my sense of self-worth and my sense of identity and membership and status in the community depends on how I'm doing in this competitive struggle that we're talking about. If I live in a society where it's very difficult for people to engage and succeed in that kind of competition, say because I've got a tax on luxury goods, that concern about identity and social status and social standing and how I stack up in society, that's very fundamental to human beings. But in some society, that concern gets attached to these status norms and economic variables. In other societies, what you would need to do to achieve a sense of identity and social status would be to contribute the most to your community, for example. I think, again, the amateur sociologist in me, having spent as much time as I have in Scandinavia, which off and on has been about 1 year over the last 10 years. In Scandinavia, where there are high tax policies, people have higher subjective well-being than we have here. It's hard to be a relatively wealthy person because the tax code makes that hard. And social status actually becomes defined in terms of more, I'll say, nurturing values, or at least that plays a value in their culture that is not emphasized as much in the US as a whole. Although in a way, actually, in Northern New England, some of those values do exist. But that's another long story. Just a quick comment. I mean, one of the things that I guess I'm arguing for is, although this is a book about economics, one of the things that needs to happen is that the divisions between the social sciences need to be closed, and we need an interdisciplinary way of doing social science. And that isn't a problem just for ecological economics, but it's one of the challenges that we see in ecological economics. Yeah.
What kind of goods or services would fall under consumptive taxation?
Well, probably more goods than you might think. When I think about social status, I think about trophy homes, and I think about SUVs. And these are symbols, very important symbols in our society, and all of us in the room have some feeling for that. But even when I get down to mundane goods, I can choose cheaper or more expensive beer. And if I buy the more expensive beer, I'm doing it maybe because I prefer that kind of beer, but also for what it says about me, right? Or I could buy inexpensive skis or more expensive skis, or so on and so forth, all down the line. So I'm not sure that there are very many classes of goods which aren't affected by this in some way, because in nearly all classes of goods, there are different levels of how should I say this? I mean, there are different qualities of goods which we associate with some notions of class identity or social status.
Could you elaborate on the connections between relative consumption-based economic theory and evolutionary theory?
What's evolutionary theory? That's a kind of I can answer that question in different kinds of ways. One way of answering the question, which I think isn't what the questioner intends, but I'll answer this version of the question anyway, is to think about evolutionary economics and evolutionary thinking in social sciences, in particular how social norms evolve. So if we construct a society where it's hard for people to pursue social status through high relative consumption, then the importance of relative consumption as a way of signaling your status would likely diminish, and the norms would evolve to focus on something else. So that's one way of answering the question. The other end of the spectrum is to say that, sociobiologists, I don't know how you feel about sociobiology. I have ambivalence about it myself, I suppose. But sociobiologists say that various organisms, including human beings, but not just human beings, have evolved to be very concerned about status hierarchies. And partly what we're seeing is this general concern, or this general issue in primate psychology about status hierarchies. We're seeing that play out in a particular modern cultural context. There's reasons why social states, why evolution would lead organisms to evolve to be concerned about relative position. Relative position confers your relative access to resources, and your relative access to resources might very well have a lot to do with your relative reproductive success in the context of a resource-constrained evolutionary setup. That's not the society we live in now, but it might be partly how it came to be. Some social scientists and biologists think that's correct.
Easterlin discussed how one's subjective well-being is affected by relative economic condition. Does this mean that those with lower income are desiring to reach equilibrium with those with more wealth, or those with more wealth desire to separate themselves as far as possible from those with less wealth?
I think those are two sides of the same coin. Juliet Schor's book, The Overspent American, focuses very, very much on exactly that problem. She says that what happened in the United States in the 1990s was essentially a new set of social norms evolved. And the new social norms focused not on the middle class American, which was sort of social norms and consumption norms were identified with the middle class in the 50s and 60s in the post-war period. What Schor says is that in the 1990s, a different ethos had emerged in which the social norms were set by the upscale, to use that term. The upscale is what? It's the top 10% of the income distribution, the top 5% of the distribution. But where people who are in the middle or at the bottom part of the income distribution are looking at what they see on TV, or they're looking at what they see in the movies, or they're looking at the big house on the hillside, or the other vehicles that they see around them. So the folks that are engaging in the upscaling are trying to stand apart from the crowd, which is to say achieving a sense of success and identity and all of that. The people who are falling behind are saying, gee, I'm falling behind. Maybe I should max out on my credit card and get more credit cards. And really those are, people that are in different positions, but it's one thing, not two different things. If that makes sense.
How do the subjective well-beings of those in predominantly bipartisan governments compare to those in other forms of government? And how about bipartisan governments which are not laissez-faire?
What kind of government, I'm sorry?
Bipartisan.
Oh, bipartisan, sorry. Okay, so we're looking at two-party systems versus multi-party systems, I guess you're asking. I guess I already answered that question on one level. Englehart's data suggests that by a small margin, the social democratic countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, have slightly higher average subjective well-being than we have here. These are countries which have multi-party political systems, and I wouldn't claim that there's necessarily a cause and effect relationship between a higher well-being, perceived well-being, and the multi-party system, but the correlation exists. Now, I can interpret that small difference in a couple of different ways. One is that when you take an average, then of course some people are on top and high, and some people are low. Part of why our value may be lower in the U.S. is because we have, well, the disparities mean that there's a lot of people who are down and out in our society, and that pulls down the average. I guess what I'd say is that, and this is amateur political science now, if you've got a bipartisan system, then the parties have strong incentives to line up in the center and cut off the tails of the distribution and not listen to the right, or at least not listen to the left, right? It's from the left that we see calls for egalitarianism and dealing with social status seeking and the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And if we're in a bipartisan system, that part of the political spectrum can be rendered less effective than in a society where there's something more like proportional representation, and where, if you're in Germany and you're the Social Democratic Party, then you have to form a government that involves the Greens, which then of course means the Greens can have a kind of influence that they don't have here. Even in Vermont they do, although I know you're struggling with that. So, well, no, I should really, the New Hampshireite should be very careful about talking about Vermont politics. Okay.
In your writings, you conclude that relative economic standing as well as absolute level of consumption are both important for an overall sense of well-being. Would you take this conclusion so far as to say that we require inequity for our sense of well-being? And would true equity in distribution lead to an overall decrease in subjective well-being?
We require inequity to, no, I don't think that's true. People are evaluating themselves against social norms that they've internalized, and those social norms depend upon what we all do. It's the case that inequality means that some people experience a sense of high social status, which is a good for them, and others experience low social status, which is a bad for them. If we close that gap, then maybe the folks that are on top experience some kind of loss. But to say that we would need to have inequality in order to have, I guess I don't see that. I mean, that's a political question, really. Yeah. We also know that the people. I mean, if you look at Englehart's data again, even at the individual level, there's a certain level at which income yields diminishing returns. And so the folks that are hurt the most by this are people that are at the lower end of the income distribution up to the middle part of the income distribution. Okay.
Do you think it's possible to accurately determine a society's subjective well-being through the English language when each individual interprets such a survey differently based on their own history and psychological makeup?
One of the papers in the edited volume by Kahneman et al. Looks at exactly that question. So the question is that we're using language to try to report something subjective about how I feel. Even if we're all speaking the same language, that can be problematic. I mean, one of the things that we've learned from the interplay between literary theory and social science is the importance of discourse, and the fact that the utterer's meaning can be different from the listener's meaning. And that's not a trivial problem, even in one language. To an extent, what I've told you is that, at least if you're looking at a given language community, that problem is less important than intuitively you might think that it might be. I mean, somehow we know how to talk meaningfully about these things. The thing is that when you do comparisons between different countries, then of course it's different languages. People might not only have different words for well-being, but in fact those words might mean something that's different. So it's not just different words, same concept. It's that the concept itself is sort of intimately embedded in our languages. People who have looked at that think, however, that despite the language gap, that even cross-culturally it's possible to make comparisons of these sorts. Although the further the gap, then the harder it is to make those comparisons meaningful.
I was wondering if, based on your studies of subjective well-being, if you created any of your own models or broken any new ground in any new discoveries?
Yeah, that's a good question. What have I done lately? The chapter that you've read is a literature review, which is extracting some ideas from other social sciences and trying to bring them into environmental economics and ecological economics. So this particular piece of writing is trying to learn from what others have done to extract some stylized facts. I think that what the contribution of that chapter is coming up with this well, it's the kind of thing I'm talking about here. Simulations about climate change in the economy and the other applications in the book. There's been very, very little work of that nature that's been done. Others have done a little bit, but I mean, that's I suppose that's really where the unique, interesting contribution is, along with trying to understand the intellectual, so there's the model runs, and the intellectual contribution is being an economist wrestling with how to take into account these theories and data that come from different intellectual traditions, and then bring those to bear on the frameworks that I work with. I mean, that's, to me, that was what was challenging about this. I don't know how original that is. Others will need to judge that.
For purposes of taxation, how would you decide what is and is not a luxury?
I'm not sure that we would limit it to taxing luxuries, actually. I like what Bob Frank says. What Bob Frank says is that we should have a tax on consumption in general, maybe setting aside certain kinds of categories. Although, again, remember, it's within any category, there's high status goods and lower status goods. And so across nearly all kinds of goods, we run into this problem. I guess what I would see is something like a graduated consumption tax with a high top rate and a large personal exemption, which is a fancy way of saying that the proportion of your overall income that you wound up paying in taxes at the end of the day would increase as your income increased or your consumption level increased. But I think, most consumption would need to be taxed. I should say too, to clarify, consumption taxes, the optimal taxation literature in economics interprets a consumption tax as like an income tax, where then you're not explicitly taxing investment, actually. Yeah, so, in some ways, the change in the tax system that would be recommended here would be less radical than it might seem.
You mentioned that a 50% luxury tax, higher taxes for higher consumption, would have benefits, i.e. more investment, less unnecessary consumption. Doesn't it seem that U.S. tax laws are in direct contradiction to this? Where is the voice of Washington for this point of view?
Yeah, voice of Washington, I'm not going to really, I'm not sure even what to say about that. What I'd say about tax policy is just that, again, if we have an income tax with a 33% rate, if we took the tax on capital off of that, then that actually would work out to be a 50% consumption tax. So in some sense, we're actually not all that far away. Where politically we're at, well, I'm not even sure where to go with the political party. I think something that intellectuals at universities need to do is to figure out how to offer different ways of thinking that are grounded theoretically in data. And that, then there's a problem about how that affects policy discourse in the world. I'm not an expert on that part, though, so I'm better at the models and the data, I hope, anyway. Put my work involved.
Okay, thanks. We'll make that the last question.